Good morning, everybody. I'm Michael Davis from Roxhill, and I hope you can hear me, which is an improvement on last time. I do apologise. Although we did get some encouraging messages of support thanking us for getting everybody out of bed on time and starting their day 2 weeks ago. But we're back, and I'm hugely grateful for Oliver Shah for joining us again. And Oliver needs no introduction. He is the business editor of the leading, or the absolutely marquee name in business media in the UK, the Sunday Times business section. Oliver, good morning, and thank you for joining us.
Morning.
Now, Oliver, you're aware that we've been talking to a number of your colleagues in the business media about how the lockdown has been impacting their lives and getting their titles out to the market. How has it played with you in the Sunday Times?
Probably similarly, I guess, in that the immediate challenge is communicating with a team and then communicating with contacts, and it's always more difficult when you're dispersed. I've been sort of pleasantly surprised at how the tech has worked so well in general, and sort of conference calls and video calls and that kind of thing has tended to get us through. I would say Sunday papers are a bit different to dailies in that you really rely on sort of exclusives and insight and colour and details gleaned from contacts, which our usual working week runs Tuesday till Saturday, and Tuesday, Wednesday, I and the reporters will mostly be out and about doing breakfasts, coffees, lunches, meetings, evening events, that kind of stuff. And you pick up so many little gems of colour and intel going around doing those things, which you obviously can't do now, which does make it a little bit harder. So you're more reliant on existing contacts and much less so on new ones. I mean, in the average week, usually you would meet 5, 10, 15, 20 new people, and you haven't got that sort of new blood flow coming through. But all things considered, I'm quite pleased at how it's worked out, and the team has pulled very hard. People have performed very well. People remark constantly at the moment that this whole crisis has shown that remote working can work, and people are just as productive as they are in the office. And actually, I find sort of people in general work a bit longer because you get your desk without any kind of commute. The day's more intense because you haven't got sort of colleagues coming over for cups of tea and coffee and lunch breaks and that kind of stuff. And people tend to work until the work is done. So people have pulled together very hard, but it's entered the sort of grueling phase now, hasn't it? Where I think everyone's ready for a bit of change. And at the Sunday Times, we started to bring back a few people to the office other than desk heads. So throughout the entire time, I've been going in Thursday till Saturday to sort of put the paper and the section to bed, as has the news editor and other section heads. And from last week, we've had 2 other reporters on business coming in, and that'll rotate around depending on who it suits. So it's nice to have a bit of human interaction back in the team, and it's amazing how much quicker things are to do when someone's right there, and you can just chat around ideas, and things get lost. Some nuance gets lost, doesn't it, in GChat or email or whatever, and when you're just in front of someone, it's much easier to shape up stories and ideas.
From the Sunday perspective, you don't quite have the same pressure of those daily deadlines as perhaps your colleagues on the dailies do. But at the same time, you've always had the problem of trying to see how the news agenda is going to evolve throughout the week. And I guess that's one of the problems of the crisis for you, is just the speed of which stories have been breaking, and the amount of them, the sheer import of what you're dealing with.
Yeah, it's a big challenge, but it's also an opportunity. It's an incredibly news-rich, fertile time right now. And I think someone said at the outset, if you can't make hay at the moment, you may as well go home, because this is one of these epochal times in business, as 2008-9 was. And it's a time really to dig in and deliver readers the absolute, cutting-edge stories. Dailies, as you say, have a different kind of deadline pressure. It's a much more intense daily pace, but the Sunday builds up and builds up and builds up, and Thursday, Friday, Saturday still have plenty of deadlines falling for long reads and then news. It's a different kind of thing, obviously. The daily still gets a lot of good scoops. The Sunday, you're supposed to sort of look around corners and try and set the agenda for the week ahead, which is a different kind of challenge. And some of it comes back to what I mentioned around the fact that you aren't out there seeing contacts in the same way, and the lifeblood of Sunday journalism is intel and new information, fresh information, stuff that helps you guess or read the runes for the weeks ahead, and that becomes more difficult. In terms of deadlines, it's no more difficult than it was before, really. It's just a case of trying to set the agenda and trying to get ahead of things, and that's a real challenge when there's so much going on. But it's also, as I said, it's an opportunity. It's time when the salmon are running, and you should be catching them.
Unless it's isn't it 14th century Scotland, where they had to have a law saying that you couldn't feed people salmon 7 days a week.
Your history's better than mine, I think.
So as lockdown is beginning to be unwound, I think everyone's beginning to think about getting back to life as normal, and people giving consideration about how they're going to run their offices. I see Michelle is very interested to hear, how you're approaching that. How are you managing social distancing with a few more of you returning to the office?
Yeah, it's a very different place. It's because I've been going in throughout the whole time. I've not noticed the changes so much, but people who came in last week for the first time were amazed that, you walk in, there are now bottles of hand wash all over reception. You can't press your own lift button. There's a kind of concierge there who presses the button for you, so you don't have to touch the surface of the lift controls. You go up, there's sort of spacing marked out in the lift where you stand. There are just fewer people in right now, so it's less a problem at the moment. But desks are spaced out, so you have sort of desks divided into red and green desks. You have no two green desks together, all that kind of stuff. So it's a much lower density office, and even were it to be full to the max with who it could be full with right now, which is not, you would still only have about a third of the office occupied because the way the desks are spaced out. So it's probably similar to any other office in the way it's being done. But it is striking in a newsroom where, the buzz and the interaction is all part of the fun. And the team is a good, close-knit, strong team. They enjoy being together. They feed off each other's energy. I like having them there because you sort of have more ideas generated and you just have more sort of heat of interaction. And it's a challenge in that way. But I think people are starting to see a path back to something resembling normality by the end of the year, but I think it's going to be a lot slower than everyone initially hoped.
It's been quite a crisis for your sector just generally. There's a catch-22 for many publications insofar as there's never been such demand for news, but at the same time, this crisis has cut off their business models at the knees. If we look at the Sunday Times, have you seen the way in which your readers engage with you change at all during the crisis?
Yeah, a little bit. I think it wouldn't surprise you to hear there's more focus on digital, and there was a strong focus already on that at the Times and the Sunday Times. But print circulation is off a little bit, as you'd expect, nowhere near as badly as it might be. Digital readership is up very strongly. Digital subs are up very strongly. And I think, it's talked about across different industries, but this crisis will accelerate the shift to digital and the shift to more sort of remote consumption of information and clothes and food and everything else. And news is no different to all that. So I think you'll see a heightened focus on online from the Times and Sunday Times. You'll see more focus on the product in terms of the app. And even readers who are more sort of established print readers who would have been with us for decades are starting to switch, and they're finding actually the experience is quite nice, and it's quite intuitively designed to replicate in the best ways the experience of reading the print product. So you can still get the best things you get from print online in a very nice, easy to use format. So I suppose in that sense we've seen interaction change. In other ways, print is still very important as well, and we put a lot of effort and craftsmanship into the print publication, and we still got plenty of old-fashioned letters from readers too, so people are still consuming it that way. So it's still a mix, but the mix is moving ever more towards digital, I'd say.
Now, this crisis has been has had has really had two stories running in it, both sort of health related. One is of the pandemic, but the other one is the health of the economy. And do you see your agenda changing at the moment to more sort of to look forward and see how people are going to get back to normal rather than the immediate impact of the pandemic?
In business, it's a bit of both. As we touched on, the Sunday mandate really is to look ahead and try and, see what's going to come around the corner and try and set the agenda. And we keep on doing that in the way we always would have done, but we apply it now to the pandemic and the economy and the return to work. So we focus very strongly on that. The news section's done a great job on the health side of things. I think more and more the debate is turning to the economy, and you look at the furlough scheme, you look at the way that's sort of acted as a painkiller in the UK's system, and you wonder what happens when UK PLC gets weaned off that properly. You look at sort of forecasts of 10% unemployment for 5 years, potentially 3.5 million people out of work. You look at all these loans being accrued under B bills and C bills and CL bills, and you look at the sort of credit ratings of the small companies borrowing them, and the sort of default rates being speculated on, which we broke the story at the weekend that RBS, Howard Davies, the chairman, was sort of talking about 50% default rate for some of these emergency loans, and all the sort of economic turmoil that will flow from that. So these are all issues that really occupy us, and I would say the key areas for us are sort of jobs, work, unemployment. Where does that go? And the debt hangover from all this state intervention, how do you clean that up? And then we haven't really seen yet the strategic support for individual companies. So we again broke the story of the government looking at ways of supporting a Jaguar Land Rover or a Tata, big strategically important UK companies, UK employers, which fall between the cracks of the current support schemes. And how that is worked out will be another key theme, I think. So you're right, the focus is very much switching from the health agenda in general to the economy now, I feel. But on the business section, we've always been very focused on trying to look ahead to that, and trying to read where it goes for the next weeks and months and years. And as you said at the start, it's not easy when things are moving so quickly, but we have to make a start of it.
No, indeed. But some of these are big, long themes, and some of these themes, I feel as though have been around since the previous crisis. There's been a lot of chat about how capitalism is going to have to respond, not just during this crisis, but in the last few years, to issues like executive pay and fairness. But you've written on a couple of times that you think actually capitalism is going to come back very strongly after the crisis.
Yeah, I've got a sort of short-term and a medium-term view. I think in the short term, people are going to be wise to rein in dividends and doff their cap to the state, and tone down the behaviour and the executive pay and all the sort of extreme ends of the animal spirits. But I think two things. There's an element of mean reversion, which I think David Smith captured very well in his Times column today. The new normal will probably look much like the old normal, in the way that by 2010 things were rocking and rolling again, when in 2008 everyone was kind of running around wringing their hands saying this is the end of capitalism. It never really is. It's kind of it's a very strong natural force that reasserts itself over time, and I think we'll see that again now, where I think I've written about how it could be even more sort of red in tooth and claw in a few years' time. I think the scale of job destruction and permanent destruction of roles in things like retail and manufacturing and steel and all these legacy industries, and the scale of corporate failure is going to be so huge this time. It's really going to make it an employer's market, and you're going to see more of a shift towards automation. You're going to see less and less power in the hands of unions, despite the sort of short-term power they might be wielding now around sort of warehouse reopenings and that kind of stuff. And I think there's going to be an interesting debate for government and how it gets when these support schemes are unwound, because while they're there, people are going to be quite careful about, not paying a dividend, or they should be, about not paying a dividend while they're furloughing staff, and not being silly with tax arrangements and pay and stuff while they're receiving government support. But when that all gets weaned off, there's going to be an interesting question for the state in terms of how involved it gets to support crucial jobs in certain areas, because you're going to see devastation on a big scale, and you're going to see more power in the hands of corporations, I think, and there'll be a sort of big debate for government in terms of how thoughtfully you can intervene in markets, and whether you sort of follow the Thatcherite route of allowing nature to take its course, or whether you try and follow a more strategic way of replanting seeds and trying to help specific areas.
Well, I definitely think there will have to be a focus on the latter there, but perhaps we can talk about that in a moment. But it's not just people who have had their business models turned upside down who are responding to this crisis. Presumably there are many boardrooms who are saying never let a good crisis go to waste. Do you think this is an opportunity for people to really rethink strategically about how they approach things and what's going to change?
Yeah, I think you're right. Someone pointed out yesterday that the Mandarin word for crisis meant problem and opportunity. And I think a lot of people will be thinking along those lines. You could see people like IAG, British Airways parent company, using this as a chance to properly do stuff to the workforce that they wanted to do for years and haven't been able to because of the unions. Like strikes right now don't matter, do they, when your entire fleet is grounded? In other ways, I think you'll see companies moving more towards automation. You'll see people using this as cover for, ditching loss-making operations, doing deals, restructuring things, rebasing store portfolios. It's a great sort of smokescreen for people who want to do stuff that would have been very difficult to do in normal times. And it's a great, card to play. This is an exceptional time, and we need to cut our cloth accordingly. And I think you'll see a lot of companies do that. I've written about a few, but I think in lots of different ways you'll see people doing that, whether it's opportunistic M&A or opportunistic administrations of parts of their business, or opportunistic nips and cuts to the workforce, or replacement of people with automation or what have you. There's going to be a lot of that kind of stuff, and I think we probably have only just seen the start of that, because we're still in the foothills of how companies think about how they reshape themselves. Yeah.
Do you think that you're going to look at things in a different way? You and your trade of journalists. We were talking to Richard Fletcher, your colleague, a couple of floors below you in the mini Shard a few weeks back, and he said certainly that they were going to perhaps kick the tires on companies announcing the way they treat things like pay and leverage was another one that came up in particular. Are you going to take a slightly different view on things in light of what's happened in this crisis?
Yeah, I think in the next few years, those are going to be key themes, aren't they? I've written about how efficient balance sheets, that entire mantra of loading companies with debt and not carrying much cash, being asset light, all that stuff has been exposed. So I think, yeah, absolutely, in the next few years, those are going to be key themes. I do think, to the points earlier, things tend to revert to the mean over time. 2008, everyone said, we're never going to carry this much debt again. We're never going to be asset light. We're never going to sail this close to the wind, blah, blah, blah. 3 years later, everyone's loading up on mezzanine debt and risk is back on, and people are piling back into retail shares and all this kind of thing. So I think there will come a time when all that stuff passes, but for the next few years, I think sort of attention on pay of people who have taken government support, attention on balance sheets, attention on sort of moral hazard in the broadest sense, not just in terms of the banks, but in terms of companies leaving themselves exposed and then throwing themselves on the bosom of the taxpayer. We're going to have a lot of stories along those lines for the next year. I think absolutely that's going to be a key broad area of focus.
No, exactly. Simon English in our Tomorrow's Business column every day, he flagged up last week how furlough is going to, companies taking furlough payments is going to really come into focus. And we had an interesting announcement from Andrew Neil at the Spectator earlier on this week. What did you make of that?
Yeah, I thought it was very laudable. I think it was in keeping with their way of doing things, wasn't it? The sort of libertarian free market approach that publication embodies. No, I think it was a good, it may have been a small thing in terms of numbers, but I think it was a good point to make, that companies that don't need to take advantage of this stuff shouldn't be doing it. And one of the great flaws of the Sunak bailout packages, which you have to say, you know, he was moving at incredible speed and overall did a very good job. But one of the flaws is, you know, they had to apply in quite a blanket way to a wide swathe of companies. So they're open to abuse, whether it's people submitting fraudulent B-bills or C-bills applications, or, you know, companies using furloughing when they don't really need to. There will be an element of that, and I suppose in the round it'll be worth absorbing the bad behaviour at the margins for the sake of saving or underpinning UK PLC. But I thought what the Spectator did was it was a good point they were making, just that people should not be seeing these things as free money from the sky, and that you know, it's better for everyone in the end if there's a clear demarcation between state and private enterprise. And as much as state has a role to play in a temporary way, helping companies through these kind of crises as it did in 2008, it's better for everyone if the state is less involved in companies. You know, companies should be free to maneuver and make money, provided they behave well in the ways they want. And it's not healthy. We've seen time and time again in history for government to have a long-term role in general in the private sector. So I think the point they were making was a good one. It was, you know, they used it when they needed to, and when they didn't, they withdrew it straight away. Well,
the unwinding of the public debt is going to be a generational issue, and it's going to raise tax issues again. Do you think tax fairness is going to be a big issue over the next year or two? And you wrote, I saw a couple of weeks ago, about how you think private equity tax arrangements may come under review. Presumably, this could also be said about tax domiciles, technology domicile arrangements, and tax havens.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are certain sort of long-standing loopholes which are due to be looked at on there. Things like the taxation of carry in private equity, and as you said, you know, the way big tech structures sales through Luxembourg and Dublin, those kind of places. I think as part of this kind of realignment over the next few years around, you know, people thinking about corporate behaviour and pay and dividends and that kind of stuff, people are going to look at tax rightly in many cases, and some of those things that have probably been ripe for reform for 10, 15, 20 years are going to be looked at. So yeah, I think we will see that.
Now, Oliver, time marches on. We could be talking about some of these themes for the rest of the morning, but I'd like to perhaps focus finally on some of the communications challenges coming out of this crisis. Have business leaders been prepared to talk to you, or do you think people are worried about you know, sticking their head above the parapet when so many moving parts are impacting their businesses?
I think they have in general. I think Luke Johnson made a decent point in the paper, whenever it was, a few weeks ago, saying that he was disappointed at how few had spoken out around lockdown and the way economics had been pushed to the back of the queue in terms of the order of importance. And I think you know, he was saying that he thought a lot of business leaders might feel compromised by having used furloughing or taken government support in some way and not wanting to sound ungrateful. I think in general, I mean, business is very adaptable, isn't it? And it always impresses me through these kind of moments of change, whether it's this or Brexit or 2008-9, these kind of big macro events where people can't really control the overall weather. It always impresses me how quick and adaptable businesses are. And I think in general, we're pretty good at communicating in the UK. I think business and media are quite well plugged into each other. And in general, especially off the record, I've found that people have been very responsive, and actually, you know, people are sitting at home all day. They quite welcome a chance to have a different viewpoint, and a journalist calling may not be such an imposition at the moment compared to when you're running around everywhere, doing results shows and all this kind of stuff. And so people in general welcome it, but I think maybe a bit more sort of public leadership might be welcome.
Are you making Zoom calls to people? Does this sort of interaction fill in any way that sort of human interaction that you were talking about earlier? Oliver, you're back.
Just on cue when you were saying to these kind of interactions replace normal life.
Exactly. So I think we know your opinion of that.
Virgin Media in Hackney is not doing the job today. So I suppose the quick answer is it's a great way to sort of replicate it, isn't it? And you can reach a lot of people. And I've been impressed at how, in general, the tech has held up and people have engaged with these things. But long term, I think I'm dying to get back to the face-to-face meetings, the chats, the little bits of colour you pick up, and the sort of the networking you get after events, and just picking up little snippets of interesting things for people. It's very hard to replicate the sort of spontaneity and the human spark of face-to-face meetings.
Yeah, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit here. Who could you point to in terms of who's had a good or bad crisis in terms of comms? Just strategically, I thought your lead last weekend was a really timely contribution by Howard Davis, for example. Just when people were beginning to focus on the banks, not necessarily behaving badly, but there was going to be a lot of focus on how banks were going to be treating people in the next few months and years. Then he came up with a positive contribution. Would you agree with that? And are there other examples that you can flag up?
Yeah, I think RBS has done quite well. I think they've embraced the whole sort of need to support SMEs through these C-bills and B-bills. I think the supermarkets in general have done a very good job. They've had certain issues around, not giving back business rates relief, which is a bit naughty, and Tesco's had its own pay issues, which have been a slight blot. But I think in general, the way they've kept supply chains going, and you walk into your local store, the staff are all chipper, things are generally in stock, and the queuing systems are quite well done. I think they will have had a good war. I think most of the big tech companies will emerge in rude health, and we've seen things like Zoom and whatever come to the fore. I think lots of companies have done okay. If you think about ones that have done less well, I think the insurers have given themselves a real reputational headache with not paying out for some of these infectious disease covers. So it's a mixed bag, isn't it?
Yeah, and actually, just reading your column over the last few weeks, it's interesting how people have. You say you had some sympathy for some of the points they were making, but often they were making them the wrong way. And I was pointing specifically to Stelios and EasyJet. We're going to just try and wrap this up now, but and I was just wondering if we could just focus on. Have you got any top tips for the hundreds of people who are joining us this morning about how they should be thinking about communicating with you and your colleagues, and what people should be focusing on over the next few months?
I think it's the same as always, really, isn't it? It's knowing the publication you're speaking to and what they're interested in, what their areas of focus are, being constructive in the way people engage. It's more difficult to network, isn't it, right now? So some of the more impromptu stuff can be tricky, but it's targeting the information to the publication and knowing what they want. And it's a time when it's kind of wartime conditions for news media, isn't it? So people are very, very focused on the big stories, and some of the more quirky, peripheral matters of interest don't make it into the paper. So it's about sort of knowing what the priorities are as well, and not sort of pushing too hard on the slightly strange left field stuff that might make a interesting small piece in better times, but which get pushed out of the paper when there's less pagination and more, focus on the crash bang wallop of events.
Do you think this crisis has changed your sort of outlook a little bit? That previously you saw your role and your section's role is to challenge the status quo and hold people to account, whereas now maybe it's to flag up some more positive stories and look for. Or is that being too simplistic?
I don't think the point around challenging the status quo or asking questions changes, but you do make a good point around the need for some sort of optimism, because you can very, very easily have page after page of job losses, companies collapsing, things being in crisis, and as ever, there are going to be winners coming out of this, aren't there? And for example, last weekend we decided across the top of pages 2 and 3 to profile 5 smaller online businesses that have been making hay throughout this. And it's just a little point to make clear that, you know, people like Moonpig or Castore, the sports brand, or any other number of nimble operators are still coming through and making good money and creating jobs and opportunities. So we do consciously try and balance, but in general, we sort of we crack on with what we're doing. We try and ask interesting and difficult questions. We try and be constructive in the way we engage with companies and government, and we try and be constructively and positively provocative, and we try and, you know, generate debate and shape debate, and we keep on trying to do that. I think being designated a key worker, which amazingly we are, sort of without being too po-faced about it, does remind you that newspapers are about more than entertainment. They're about you know, supplying genuinely thoughtful, rigorous analysis and news to people. And you know, these kind of crises remind everyone that we need proper media outlets. You can't just rely on, you know, as good as it is, the BBC, and you can't rely on the free stuff you find on the internet. You need to have proper, if you're serious about understanding business or politics or the state of current affairs, you need to have proper journalism. And whether that's the Sunday Times and the Times, or the Economist, or the FT, or Bloomberg, or the New York Times, or the Washington Post, these publications are genuinely important, we think, and it's galvanized the team to know that they are working for something that is more than about, you know, it's more than the sum of the parts. It's about providing something special and something valuable, and it's been a very timely reminder of that.
Well, what an interesting time to be in your position, and but at the same time, I think you do put your finger on an absolute crucial point there, that newspapers are important, and the role that you do is rightly a key worker's job, and newspapers are a very important part of being British as well, and it's for, I think, I'm sure I'm speaking for everybody who's joining us on the right there, that we've been hugely impressed by how you and your trade have kept the show on the road and kept a really excellent product right the way through lockdown. So thank you for that, Oliver, and thank you for joining us this morning. Sorry to people on the right, there are lots of little questions that I just haven't been able to sew in, but I hope what we have talked about has been helpful. There were a couple of questions at the beginning, and I think this might be something to finish on, Oliver, but you must, do you get fed up every time someone asks you, oh, have you spoken to Philip Green recently? Or should we be expecting a big feature in the Sunday Times about lockdown in super yachts?
I'm sort of wary of being the bloke in the pub playing the same old song in 20 years' time, but I do still hear from him occasionally, and he's as charming as ever, I would say. But I think the sort of that generation of rag traders have slightly been left behind in all this, haven't they? And there's going to be a bit of a generational change, and the sort of the boohoos and the misguideds and the ASOSs will continue to prosper, and I think the PGs will spend more time with their yachts.
Excellent. Well, I'm not going to risk you dropping off again. Presumably there are lots of school children about to log in your neighbourhood, and then we might get another little glitch. But anyway, Oliver, thank you for joining us this morning, and we will catch up soon.
Thank you, Michael.